Welcome to another video. In this video I want to show you how to create image viewer that you can extend to your full screen and switch between images. So first what we are gonna do is to create in our main activity. Main activity is our entry point to application where we can manage the whole life cycle of application. So let's begin with our onCreate method that it is fire up on the application run. So here we are invoking the parent method onCreate and passing some bundles. That's not really important. But what is important that we are invoking enable edge-to-edge method. It's not really important actually for this project. This method will ensure that you will have properly aligned all the elements on your UI, like navigation bars, etc., according to Google material. So that's the first method. Another method that we want to create our composable view. So to create composable view, we have to invoke the setContent method. Inside this method, we have access to composable context. So by having access to this context, now we can use all the composable functions and methods related to it, which will simplify the process. So first we'll define the list of painter. The painter is our image in the format of painter object. It can be either in XML file or PNG extension file. Alright, so nevertheless, let's define the list of, and in the list of, it will automatically create list of view with all the elements that you will pass by on the creation. So what we're gonna do, just because we have access to context, composable context, now we can invoke painter resource method, which is composable method, and by passing our object, which is our main directory, to our drawable. So now we have access to all the images that we have. I have some list of random images here, so we just passing it, creating the list of painters, unmutable lists because we're not gonna extend it. So now we have defined images and imported to our project. Another thing that we're gonna do is finally create our composable screen. So the first element is our theme, which is the wrapper of all the content that will be on our screen. So this theme will define default colors and adjust it for your own needs to configure it. You can go to the theme Kotlin file, and here you can define all the colors, primary, secondary for light screen and dark theme. So nevertheless, that's not the point of this tutorial. So now we have our wrapper. So wrapper will by default style all the elements that will be inside it. Another element is the scaffolding. Scaffolding will ensure that all the elements inside will be aligned to material styling guideline. So what it means that it will pass the inner padding that you can also configure it in your theme Kotlin file. And it will pass the inner padding that you're gonna define in your theme. But finally here we are defining our custom composable screen view, which is gonna be our image view container. So to this screen we'll pass the modifier, the padding, which will take our padding from scaffolding that is globally defined. And here we'll pass the list of images. So now let's move on to see how image viewer screen, our main container, was implemented. So this is our main composable container. So as you know, to define globally your composable container, what you have to do is to define function and define parameters that you're going to be passing to this function and put some annotation, which is in this case add composable. So what we have here, modifier, is our factory styling object that will basically by chaining you can add different modifiers to your component and style it accordingly. Another is our list of images, that is a painter object. So here in our composable context, first we're gonna define our scroll state because we want to have images aligned in a row where you can scroll them just like in some audio player, for example. So now we have to define by invoking composable function remember scroll state, and this will define the state of your scroll. And if you assign it to the component, that you're going to be able to scroll it smoothly. Okay. Another thing that we're going to define is our flag. So by define remember, so every time you reload your composable function, your composable object, basically, it will just basically, as the name suggests, will remember all the value that is assigned to it. So you can change it because it's variable. So it's mutable, and because it's a mutable state of flag, which is by a starting point false, you can modify it accordingly, and every time it will be reloaded, you will be able to have the previous value that you assigned to it. Another variable that we're going to be using is our selected index. So in this case, we're going to change the integer, the value. So in this case, we're going to remember on which particular image you clicked on. So every time you want to extend your view, you will get to the image that you clicked. All right, so that's enough from it. So the first thing we want to do is to define our animated visibility. And in this object, it's another wrapper that enables you to animate the transition between objects. So in this case, we want to animate the opening and closing of our image full screen viewer. What we can pass here, we can pass obviously the Boolean flag, which is defining if it's open or not. And here we can define the animation on the opening and on the exiting. So here we have already defined to fade in, fade out. And I defined that besides fading in and fading out, I want to also scale it, zoom in and zoom out. So this is how it's gonna look like. And Z-index define the level of the layer. So we have this wrapper. So inside this wrapper, now we can define another view that we're gonna implement later on. But for now, we just passing the selected index of the current image that you click on, the list of images, because we want to, when it's gonna extend it, we want to move to another image, not just close it and then click on another one. So it's gonna be some extended version basically. And here we're defining the onClose callback function. That it's gonna change our flag to false and we'll basically close this thing up. Another thing, we have to define the list of our images and place them and style it so it's gonna look nice. First, we're gonna define box, because with box, easier to position it on your screen. What I mean by that, first of all, we're gonna define modifier that's gonna extend it on the whole screen. So now when we have our global wrapper on our screen, we're gonna define the row of images. Now, because we have box, we can align it the way we want basically. And in my case, I'm gonna align it on the center of the screen. I'm gonna extend the width of this row to the maximum of our screen. And here we're gonna assign our state, which is defined over here, scroll state. So now when we assign state, we have possibility that every element that is go beyond of our screen will be scrollable basically. It's happening automatically. That's the magic of composable function. So another element that we'll nest here, we're gonna use our list and loop over our list. And I'm using the method called for each indexed. So we have access to the current index of the element. And of course our image. So our image is a painter object. When we are looping over, every loop will create another box. And this box will have fixed size. So I want to define like 120 per 120. DP has this magic that will automatically align and not gonna lose its quality regardless of the size of your screen. So that's the beauty, like comparing to pixels, that when they're gonna extend, they're gonna get pixelized basically. Another modifier that we're gonna define here, because we want to have a border that has chopped line basically, and there is nothing by default, so we have to define our own function for it, our own modifier, and we want to draw basically behind our element. So this is what you're nesting here to make it possible. So first you want to draw a stroke, and here we define the width and the effect. And in this effect you can define the length of the line, like the gap between them, and so on and so forth. So once we have a stroke around our element, is our border, then you can just pass it to draw round rectangle. And because styling of our rectangle will be a stroke, then there you go. And here I also want to make it some radius of our corners. So I will use just float number 5, which will have a little edge. And the color. Alright, so that's our border of the element. And the next modifier, we want to make it clickable. So to make it clickable, you just use clickable modifier. Inside this function, we will assign the index of every element that we are looping over. And also we want to, during the click, want to make our screen to extend to the full screen. So this is the box, our wrapper. But we need to display also images. To display, we'll use a default image element from Android library, default library, and which is basically just image. And we just passing the image painter here. We assign description. In this case, I'm using the resources that you can define in your values strings XML. So what it gives you here, that every time you define the list, you have just one source of truth, and you can define another file with string and extend it to, for example, ES. If you want a Spanish translation, you can define all the values, translate it to Spanish, and you will automatically switch between languages. So that's the point of it. We're not gonna do this here, but just as a good practice, I recommend it to always use some global variables from external files. So nevertheless, we just put the content description for accessibility. We're gonna extend our image to fill the whole box, and we want scale to fit inside. So it's not gonna lose the resolution of the image. It's not gonna be too extended, so it's not going to be pixelated. It will just fit, so it will keep the original resolution. And now we can move on to our another composable function, which is our image full screen. Let me show you how it looks so far. So let's run our application. It's going to take a while because this emulator is heavy in terms of resources of your computer. So it's demanding. Nevertheless, let's wait for emulator to run. Right, so our application is about to start. So as I told you, we invoked first onCreate method. So now we have lists of our random images. Because we set up clickable method, you automatically have this ripple effect on your images. So because for now I didn't include our external component, which is our viewer, so for now it doesn't do anything, but as you can see, I can smoothly move it around. Image full screen composable, or component in this case, is the component that we will transition to. So in this case, as a parameters, we have as well modifier that we're going to pass from the parent object. We have selected index, so we'll open exactly what you click on. We have list of images, so you can switch smoothly between them. And we have our callback function to close it from the outside and control the state basically from the outside as well. So by having access to the scope of your routine of composable component, you can invoke some actions to process it parallelly to the main run of your application. You can make some unblocking actions like processing something. Another thing that we're gonna define is our pager state. So every time we're gonna change to another image, we're gonna remember of the position of our page. For this, we're gonna use our default component from Android library. So here we're just passing our selected index, the initial page. And here we have basically the size of all images. So now we have defined the state of our page. If we want to use our touchscreen to zoom in, we have to define the scale that we want to zoom in on our image. So for this, we're gonna define our float number and gonna remember it. We offset, we're gonna move the image around. And here we have our possible offsets. By having possible offsets, we know where is the border of our image. We're not gonna go above this place to see basically nothing. So by having the box size, now we're gonna be able to calculate the possible offsets that we can basically touch screen around, move around. So here we just define the constant values of the maximum of scale we can zoom in and the minimum. And this this is, remember transformation state. So if you assign transformation state as a modifier to your component, you will get access on every change on this callback function. So on every change, you will be able to see what kind of zoom the user did and what is the offset of every action that user did. This is another parameter that we don't need. So first thing, on every zoom change, we can calculate what is the scale. So zoom change is our float number that we multiplying by our scale. We have our range of possible scale, so we're not gonna extend above that. And no matter what's gonna be here, you will match these parameters. So our offset will just add, and this is our global offset. And if we want to calculate the possible offset of the x axis, what we're gonna do, use the width multiply by the scale. Scale will be little below 1, and if you subtract it from the box width and divide it by 2, the offset, you have the middle image. So the offset, here are the minus values, here are the plus values. So you have to divide it to have this range of values. So we do the same for the y-axis. So now we have the borders, so every time user using the touch screen will be moving around, it's not gonna extend any of these values. Alright, so we assigning those values here to our variables. First thing, we're gonna define our container, which we're gonna extend to the whole screen. And we're gonna align it in the center, assign some modifiers, so filling to the max size, as I mentioned. Here we make sure that it's gonna be above any other elements on our screen. Here we're gonna clip, because I like the rounded corners, we clip it, basically this container. We assign the color of the background, and here on the load of our box, we will get coordinates. So by having those coordinates, now we know what is the size of our box, and now we have the width that we're gonna use to calculate our possible offset. So this is our global wrapper, and here we will have the box, another box in our wrapper. So in this case, it's gonna be exit button again above, and the lower is the higher in the hierarchy. So it has fixed size, which is 48 dp. Gonna align to the top and the end, so we want to have here in the top end corner our X button. The offset, just to make it a little farther from the edges, we wanted to have it a circle shape, little background, and inside on this background we will have the X image, and we want to make it clickable. We will invoke our callback that will gonna be passed from here. So inside our wrapper of the image, we will the image itself, and here once again we're using the composable function that will pass the location of our image, which is defined in the XML, which is our drawable vector. Here is the description, and we want to make sure that our image is fully in our wrapper, this little wrapper, and we want to make it to fit. So this is our close button, and here we are defining our pager. So this pager, what it makes, that it will make sure that every time that you click, it will automatically move from one scene to another, and we can decide that we can define the content of the every scene that you're gonna see. So because we defined the state previously, we are starting with the selected index. And here, to make sure that it's not gonna re-render every time, you have to put any key to distinguish it from any other element. So here we have access to index, and what we're gonna pass is just our image extended to the full screen. So we want to make sure that it's stretched to the whole size. To make it transformable, we will have access to all the actions that users are gonna do, manipulate with the screen. So we assign this state. And another thing is our graphic layer. So we can, on every change, we can dynamically change the scale of our image. So here we're gonna assign the scale that was from the float number, the axis, X and Y, and also using our transformation. So here is our possible offset X. So if this value is gonna extend it, which is gonna be beyond the border of our image, we'll just assign our possible offset, keep in the screen. And it's the same on the other side. We just make the offset on this side to fit, and so user is not gonna be able to move further than that. And if we didn't go beyond of that, we'll just use our current offset, and we're doing it the same for Y value, Y axis. Here is our image that we are passing, and Passing our index to get the image from our list, we scale our image to fit inside, so it's not gonna stretch, get pixelized. It will keep the original resolution, and the content description can be basically null. But if you want to be accessible, you have to pass some content. And another thing, if we want to switch to another picture, another buttons that will move from one state of the pager to another, switch to another scene. If our current page is beyond 0, we are able to move to another page basically. And here is our wrapper, and we have also fixed dimensions. It is gonna be aligned in the center of our picture. And in this case, I'm gonna pass another arrow icon to this image, so the description is defined there. And in our modified, I will extend it to the full screen, make it clickable. And in this case, every time we changing the value of the pager, we have to invoke it in our scope to make this process parallel to our main process. That's why we need our scope function that we're gonna launch. We're doing it because we want to animate between our states in our pager. So here, when we know that our current page is above 0, so we can go back to the left. We have to decrease the number of the pages. Yeah, this icon will be above any other images. And to go on the right direction, we have to make sure that number of the maximum pages that we have defined in our list is not extended. And here page count is -1 because we're counting from 0. And this is our current page, so we don't want to go beyond that. And here will be the same thing, the same arrow with a different direction. So now let's test our app. Alright, so let's run our application. It will take a while, we have to rebuild it once again with all the changes that we made. Alright, just because we previously built it, partially at least, so now it runs much faster. So if you hold, which is in this case just sliding, if you make a one click, then this is what's gonna happen. You'll extend this picture to the full size of the screen. And just because we are passing the current index, we will get selected precisely the image that we clicked on. Alright, so we have extended pictures, and by clicking on the pager animation, now we are switching between those pictures. Pretty cool, huh? If you like what I'm doing, leave a like, subscribe, and see you in the next one. Peace.